We live in a world that would have us all believe that basically all religions lead to the same place, and that it really doesn't matter what you believe because eventually we all die and we all go to a good place. That's what 90% of Americans believe anyway, that believe in heaven and there's a good God and a good heaven and a good place and everybody's good. So at least we all think we're good enough, so we all go there, and it doesn't really matter if you get there through Christianity or whatever. At the same time, it's kind of odd. We go to school, we go to universities and graduate school, and they tell us that, it's fine to believe whatever you want to believe and all roads lead to God, but I'd be kind of careful about this way to God. Because this is not a book that can be trusted, that because there are so many errors and so many contradictions, because there's so much about the supernatural, that it's good maybe for motivation, and politicians love to pick phrases out of here and use them strategically, but other than that, it's not really something that you could place your faith in. Because after all, it's just a book like every other book, but it's not even as good as most other books, many would argue. And so you came out of your freshman year of college and some professor dismantled your Sunday school faith, and they were smarter than you and had more degrees than you, and then you got busy and you never looked back. And when anybody brings it up or throws out, what about the Bible, you're quick to throw out the things they told you years ago that you never investigated. Well, it's full of errors and it's full of contradictions. Well, actually, no, I haven't read it, but I'm just sure it's full of errors or contradictions, or somebody would have told me by now that it's something I should read. And yet the odd thing is, here we are, thousands of us, and all over this city, tens of thousands more, and all over this country, millions of people gather on Sunday morning to worship the God of this book and claim to have a relationship with the Son of the God who gave us this collection of books. And more than that, almost a third, or some people say over a third of the world's population claim to be Christians. Over a third of the world's population claim they believe in God and that He sent His Son and His name was Jesus, and that through Jesus they have found forgiveness of sin, and they place their whole eternity based on that claim. Now, how is that? Are we just that unstable? I mean, do we just need propping up that much? Is there something in all of us, or in enough of us, that says, I don't know if it's true, and I don't even want to know if it's true, but I got to have something other than what I see and hear, that as we heard this morning in the baptism videos, there is this vacuum, there is this hole, there is this vacancy, and all the stuff I have and all the relationships I have, I just can't fill it, and I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but gee, it seems to work, so I'll just kind of go with that and then pass it on to my kids. I mean, is that all there is to this? I mean, how is it that this book is so easily discredited, and yet there's so many of us that keep reading it and believing in it? What's that about? So for the next few weeks, we're going to answer that question. And for the next 3 weeks, we're going to talk about why specifically we can place our faith in the fact that 4 of the books we find in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are reliable testimonies, are reliable records of something that actually happened in history 2,000 years ago. And basically the argument's going to kind of go like this, and we'll give you some phrases up on the screen. It's going to go like this. We're going to argue that the New Testament books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are a reliable record of things that actually happened, that the Gospels are a reliable record of actual events and actual conversations. If that is true, then what the Gospels have to say about Jesus is true as well, because that's what the 4 Gospels talk about. And if what the 4 Gospels have to say about Jesus is true, then in fact He must be the Son of God based on the miracles He performed, the claims He made, and the fact that He rose from the dead. And if in fact He is the Son of God based on the claims He made and the fact that He rose from the dead, then what Jesus says about the rest of this book must be true, and maybe most or more importantly, what Jesus said about God is true. People ask me all the time, they'll say, well, Andy, do you believe the thing about Jonah and the fish? I mean, give me a break, Adam and Eve. I always say the same thing. I say, you know what? It's hard to believe that stuff. I mean, it's weird. I mean, I know more weird stuff in the Bible than maybe most people because I'm a professional Christian. You pay me to know the Bible. So you think you've heard some weird stories. I bet I could tell you some stories in there you haven't even heard yet. You'd be like, what? And that all comes back down to this. Do I believe those things happen? Yeah. And it's not because I've ever seen anything like that. It's real simple. Because I believe, as we're going to see for the next few weeks, that the evidence clearly points to the fact that these 4 New Testament books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, actually record events that happened in history. And if they record events that happened in history, then what they say about Jesus is true. And if what they say about Jesus is true, then He came from God. And when a man speaks on behalf of God, I don't know about you, but I just kind of go with that. Especially when he predicts his own death and resurrection. I just always go with the guy that rose from the dead. I don't really care what he teaches. I'm for him, I want to know about that. because it's my greatest fear. Like it's your greatest fear. So we're going to talk about, can we, and this is important, can we trust, not the whole Bible, we're not going there. We're going to ask the question, can we depend on what these 4 books say about one individual, the Lord Jesus? Now, as we go down this little path and this little argument, series of arguments, there's 2 things you got to keep in mind. First of all, whenever you're talking about history or things that have happened in the past, there's 2 things you got to keep in mind. Number 1, you can't prove or disprove things that have happened in the past. That it's not a matter of proving, it's a matter of looking at evidence. And that's why in a courtroom, you don't really prove anything. You basically present evidence, and a jury looks at the evidence and makes a decision. So whenever we talk about the past, we have to ask the question, what does the evidence point toward? Or we can say it this way, the trustworthiness of any historical account is judged on the basis of evidence, not proof. For instance, tomorrow you go to work and you say to people in your office, say, hey, I went to North Point Community Church yesterday. And somebody walks over and says, I heard you say you went to North Point Community Church yesterday. You didn't go to North Point Community Church yesterday. You say, well, I certainly did. They say, prove it. You say, well, I got the bulletin. That didn't prove anything. I got a tape. That didn't prove anything. Hey, Fred, come over here. Didn't you see me at North Point Community Church? Yeah, I saw him there. Didn't prove anything. He could be lying. Whenever it comes to asking the question, did something happen in the past, you can't prove it. You can only prove what is observable and repeatable. In science, you observe and you repeat. You observe and you repeat. But you can't observe the past, and you can't repeat in actual real time the past. It's not observable and repeatable. So when it comes to trying to figure out what happens in the past, we ask the question, what is the evidence? And we make decisions based on evidence. The second thing is this. As you look at evidence, you have to ask the question, not what is a possible explanation, but what is the most probable explanation. Say it this way. When drawing conclusions about evidence, probability takes precedence over possibility. It's possible that you stole the bulletin. It's possible somebody gave you the tape, and it's possible you got to Fred before everybody else and said, hey, Fred, I'm going to say I went to North Point. I mean, all of that's possible, but the probability is you actually went to church. When it comes to the legal system, you've heard the phrase probable cause. People ask the question, what was the probable cause? Not the possible cause, because there's 50 possibilities, but what's the most probable cause based on the evidence as presented? That's how you determine, that's how you look at history. Years ago, I was in a car wreck. I was driving my wife's car that we inherited, or she got when we got married. Her dad gave it to her, then I guess he gave it to me, didn't he, when he gave her to me? Anyway, so I had this big American car, this is years ago, with a real bumper. They used to make real bumpers you could see, like big piece of steel that wrapped around the back line. Now, that's a bumper. And on the bumper had a big old giant piece of rubber. I mean, you knew where the bumper was. And I'm sitting still at Highway 41 over in Cobb County. It's a 4-lane. And I'm turning left across traffic. And this lady in a Volvo station wagon, it was raining. I don't know, there was a lane beside me that was wide open. There was nobody around. She just plowed right into the back of me, just boom, and totaled her Volvo. The engine dropped out, fire, but steam, and liquids, You couldn't even tell my car had been hit, honestly. We never had it fixed. We never even took it in. There was nothing wrong. It tore, and it kind of ripped the piece of rubber that went around the big old American steel bumper. Her car is totaled. So I get in the car. I'm already in the car. I get out and look. Then I go pull across traffic, and I park on the other side, 2 lanes away, facing the other direction, and she's standing by her car, and we wait for the police to come. True story. So the policeman gets there. I'm on the other side. Okay, I'm not even close. So here's this Volvo that's total sitting out in the middle of Highway 41 with nothing around it. The policeman pulls in behind her, gets out of his car, and she chats a minute. Then he walks out in front of her Volvo, and meanwhile, I'm trying to get across to come over and talk to the policeman. And I notice he's standing there looking at the front of her Volvo, and he's looking over here on the street. And he's looking, he gets out his pad. And when I walked up, I looked, and there's a dead possum about 15 feet that had been hit the night before. I mean, it's like a, dead possum. So I walk up, and the Fulton County policeman, it was so funny, he looks at me with this grin on his face. He said, "This possum do all that?" Now, is that possible? I don't know. The bionic possum got up, she hit it and totaled the car and killed the possum. Look what he did. But nobody, that's not, that's not probable. I mean, you could weave some tale, but what about this? What if she'd said, "Oh, officer, I'm so glad you're here this to save me from this evil man." I pulled up behind him. He jumped out of his car, opened his trunk, got out a sledgehammer, and beat the out of my car, totaled my car. And then before I could do anything, someone drove up and he handed the sledgehammer to the person and drove off, and "Thank you, officer, for being here." And is that possible? It's possible. I mean, if we went to court, would it be like, "Excuse me, ma'am, you want to go over that one more, What about this one? "Sir, officer, I'm so glad you're here because I pulled up behind Mr. Stanley. He put his car in reverse and rammed me. Then he put it in reverse and he rammed and he rammed and he rammed and he rammed and he totaled my car. And then he drove over there and he's going to tell you that I ran into the back of him. Is that possible? It's possible. Is it probable? I mean, why would you even go there? The point is this. When it comes to possibility, you can look at any event in the past and come up with all kinds of possible explanations. But the question is, when you're trying to arrive at what actually happened, you ask, in light of the evidence, what is the most probable explanation? And what we're going to see, I hope, or what the evidence I'm going to throw your way is this, that as we begin to look in detail at where these 4 books, not the whole Bible, not the whole New Testament, as we look in detail at the evidence given in these 4 books, the most probable explanation, I mean, you can come up with all kinds of possibilities why 4 different men wrote 4 similar accounts about the same Jewish carpenter over a 3-year period. I mean, you can come up with all kinds of reasons why 4 guys would take the time to do that, I guess. But the most probable explanation is because this is what happened. That's why they wrote it down. So we're going to look at the evidence. Now, there's 2 ways to look at ancient manuscripts, and basically the Bible is an ancient manuscript. All of ancient history comes from ancient manuscripts because things were written down, and that's how we got what we got. The question is, how do you determine whether an ancient manuscript is trustworthy? And in scholarly circles, there's basically 2 things you do. You look at the actual manuscript, the date and the distribution of the manuscript. And then secondly, you find out what you can about the people who wrote the manuscript. You ask the question, are these reliable people? Are these people that could be trusted? Did they have a motive to write what they wrote? You know, were they being paid by somebody? Was there an angle? You know, was there a reason other than what we know of on the surface why they would write these things? Next week, we're going to look at the witnesses themselves, the guys who wrote this. But today, for just a few minutes, and I'll try to keep this from being boring, I want to talk to you a little bit about the manuscripts themselves. Because this is extremely important, especially as you think about the New Testament manuscripts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John specifically, compared to other ancient manuscripts that come from the 1st century. Let me illustrate it this way. You see, when you were in high school, you got a book that looked kind of like this. This is actually a high school history book. And I turned over to the place where it talks about Roman history. Let me read you something interesting here, okay? Because you read this stuff and you think, gee, where did they get this? Did they find like novels buried in the dirt, like this is a Roman history book and written in Latin and we translated it into English? Is that how we know what happened? But basically, historians took bits and pieces and fragments and took all the information they could and wove it together, and they come up with these seamless stories that appear in our history. This is kind of neat. Listen to this. This is sort of right in the middle of a paragraph. Caesar realized that he could not win power without a loyal army, so he made himself proconsul of Gaul, a region that is today known as France. In his 10 years as proconsul, Caesar brought all of Gaul under Roman rule and showed his superb abilities as a military leader and organizer. Caesar issued written reports about his campaigns and victories to keep the people of Rome informed. Students in Latin can still read these clearly detailed reports in what is known as the Gallic Wars. Now you read that and you stop and say, how did they know that? No video, no pictures, no novels, no history books. How did they know that much detail that he did this? He did this for 10 years. It goes on. Crassus died in 53 BC. Pompey, meanwhile, grew jealous of Caesar's rising fame. Dun, 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 dun. To head off his rival, Pompey made himself the sole proconsul. Then he persuaded the Senate to order Caesar to return home without his army. How do they know that? I mean, and that's basically what history books are about, right? They just go on and on. You read this stuff and you go, this is so fascinating. Where did they get that information? It's real simple. From ancient manuscripts. In fact, it's interesting. In this high school book, it references the commentaries on the Gallic Wars. Let me tell you about the Gallic Wars. The Gallic Wars is a manuscript. We have 10 copies of it. We have 10 copies of the Gallic Wars. It was written in the 1st century by a fellow who was hired by the emperor to write a history. Now, just let me throw this out. You're smart folks. You know, can we trust everything written by a historian that's working for the emperor? The emperor's saying, I want you to write a history about me. Go ahead. I'll read it later. You know. So when you're hired by the emperor to write a history of Rome about the current emperor, his legacy, and his ancestors, I mean, there's just going to be some stuff you leave out, right? Because he's going to either scratch it out or scratch you out, right? I mean, so anyway, basically the Gallic Wars, it's interesting. We have 10 copies of this document. Only 10 survived. And interestingly enough, the earliest one, the one that goes back the furthest, is dated 900 AD. Now, this happened in the 1st century.